All of Affect Autism's podcasts are produced and edited by Daria Brown. Please note that the views expressed during all episodes are solely those of the individuals involved, do not constitute educational or medical advice, and do not necessarily reflect the views of Affect Autism, Daria Brown, nor ICDL and associated parties. Listeners should consult with professionals familiar with their individual circumstances for specific support.
You're listening to the We Chose Play podcast from Affect Autism, where affect is the #1 tool we use in supporting development through playful interactions. Welcome, listeners. I'm Daria Brown. This is the We Chose Play podcast from Affect Autism, now on Spotify. So hopefully that's exciting and we'll get some new listeners. This week I have a new guest for the first time. Brookes Barrack is a speech-language pathologist and DIR expert training leader who has a clinic just outside of Kansas City, Kansas, with Occupational Therapist Emily Tritz. And it is called Kansas City Developmental Therapies, where they offer various DIR services. This summer, they became an official accredited DIR organization with the International Council on Development and Learning. So that's exciting. Congratulations and welcome.
Thank you.
Now,
I'm so excited to be here.
Oh, well, I'm so excited to have you. We've been emailing back and forth and we finally found a time that we can record. And Brookes is in her lovely home in Kansas City, Missouri, which is just across the state border from her clinic. Now, she originally trained in Floortime at The Bunker, which I've heard lots of stories about, with Doctors Greenspan and Wieder in Washington, D.C. back in the day. And she also originally had that original play project training with Dr. Rick Solomon that was at the time held at his home. And his wife made you guys cookies, I hear. So this is a real veteran floor timer, let's say that. So I'm very excited to have you on this episode, Brookes, talking about gestural development, the D, the I, and the R. So I know that this is something that was so important to Dr. Greenspan, and Jean Christian was a guest I had on a number of years back who talked about how much this seems to be, at the time he felt, overlooked in the training of Floortime and how essential it was to Dr. Greenspan when he was training with him.
Because I'm a speech language pathologist, it's something we touched on in graduate school, and that was 20 some years ago for me, but we didn't really talk deeper about it. And it wasn't until I had the gift of more floor time training, especially with my mentor, Sherry Kahn, who's a wonderful speech language pathologist. And when we would do those video reflections back in the day, she would always say, "Tell me about his gestures." And I would think, why? Like, why is this so important? Because for years, as a working speech language pathologist, I would check off the box on a standardized assessment or during a language assessment and talk to families and hear that kids weren't waving. That's not something they would see, or hear that they weren't pointing, but I didn't do anything with that information. And it didn't lead me to further wonderings until I started diving deep into DIR and floor time. And once I did, I thought, we're missing so much. And now, even in my practice, we have a lot of fieldwork students, a lot of graduate students, and I always ask them, what are you guys talking about with gestural development? And they say, not much. And I think, we're missing so much, specifically because a lot of caregivers tell us too that that was something they first noticed about their children, right? They noticed their children who are neurodivergent or autistic, they noticed they weren't gesturing in the same way as siblings, or in the same way they thought that they would be gesturing. And so I think if we're really mindful and looking at this, then it can help us dive deeper and support language, because we also know that there's a lot that gestures do, not just for communication, but also to help support working memory and long-term memory. So that's why I got interested in this.
Okay, well, I can't wait to hear more about how it impacts the memory piece that you just talked about. But when you say gestural development, the D, the I, and the R, do you want to go through each?
Yeah. So if we want to define what a gesture is just a movement of the body or limbs that expresses or emphasizes a feeling or idea. Or said another way, a gesture is an image in material form. And I think that's important, that definition, to think about later. But in predictive development, between around 7 to 9 months, we see children, babies, starting to gesture, right? And so they're gesturing because in predictive development, gesturing is easier for the body than the more coordinated motor plan of speech. So we see gestures first, and in predictive development, we actually see some gestures come in, and those kind of gestures, if they're representational gestures, we see about 3 months later the speech come in for that gesture. So these gestures are developing, but what's cool about the development of these gestures is it brings in the R too, because it brings in the relationship with the caregiver. So we think about first gestures. Maybe think about the gestures of when a baby wants to be picked up. What do? They reach both arms up, right? It's not a super coordinated gesture, but it does require you to be able to sit and you to be able to coordinate that movement. And then if we have this lovely back and forth with an attuned caregiver, what does the parent do? They pick the baby up, right? And so the baby starts to learn, I have agency in this world, right? And so the more we as caregivers are responding to this development of gestures, the more we get the gestures back. So it's this bi-directional, I do something as a baby, the caregiver does something in response, and then we get it more robustly. So when we're thinking about development, we're thinking in those FEDCs 3 and then more robustly in FEDC 4.
Okay, so for people that are listening are like, what the heck's DIR and what the heck's FEDC? I'm just going to back up a step because, now that I'm on Spotify, I'm very proud of the fact that I got myself on Spotify. I felt like I needed a PhD to figure out my RSS feed and how to program, get it in the right spot to work. So for those that might be a new listener, what the heck is this We Chose Play Affect Autism? We're talking about the developmental individual differences relationship-based model, or DIR Floortime, where we meet children or anyone where they are at developmentally in the moment, taking into account their individual profile, their unique profiles of who they are, including sensory processing and other factors, and use the relationship, that trusting, warm, caring relationship, so they feel safe enough to be able to demonstrate these capacities that they have, functional, emotional, developmental capacities, FEDC. And in the Floortime Bible, per se, the Engaging Autism book that came out, it's outlined in there a number of functional, emotional, developmental capacities, but we tend to focus in Floortime on the first 6 that we're working on with children who have developmental differences. And so when we're talking about FEDCs, she said FEDC 3. The first one is, self-regulation and shared attention, interest in the world, where you're able to sort of be calm and regulated enough to engage at the second functional, emotional, developmental capacity with somebody, and share that that gleam in the eye that you get when you and your children lock eyes. And engagement may or may not involve eye contact with some kids. And then the third capacity is this back and forth, intentionality and two-way communication. So like you said, the child lifts their arms up, the mother or dad picks them up, and the child goes, ah, or something like that, and that would be a circle of communication. Talk about how important this pre-verbal affective communication is before speech and language develop. And of course, some children do not develop speech and language, but they can communicate in so many ways. So that's just a sidebar for people that wanted that refresher. You described what a gesture is and that idea that gestures come before speech. And I know, for instance, when I was given questionnaires about my autistic son, who's now 15, they said, oh, does he point to things and look at you, to show you? And I said, no. And then it must have been 4 years later-ish, give or take, and all of a sudden he started pointing at things. And I was like, ah, he's doing it. So a lot of times with this developmental model, we see development unfold in these ways, but it might take longer in some kids. And in my son, it's been a lot slower of a process, but it still follows this developmental trajectory, even though it might look different. So I guess let's go into, you mentioned the R. How do you you look at that D and that I within that R?
So in the world of DIR and Floortime, we're always talking about these functional, emotional, developmental capacities and how individual differences then impact those capacities, right? And so if we want to talk about the I a little bit, we can talk about in predictive development in that example I gave of a baby around 9 months old, say, sitting on the floor and being able to lift their arms up. So then we might think about, well, what individual differences could impact a baby being able to do that, right? So we might think about postural control, the ability to sit up, right? The ability to sit and have that control. And I think often of like, I, for example, have twins. My oldest kids are twins. And one had really great postural control. And also like things were happening very predictably for her. And so she could do all of this stuff really easily and in a very coordinated fashion. And her twin sibling could not, right? He needed both hands for a long time on the ground to sit up. Well, you can't have both hands on the ground and also bring them up, right? So that's just one little individual difference. It doesn't mean maybe he didn't have the idea. It doesn't mean that he didn't want the same thing. But at that time, his individual differences impacted his ability to do it, right? So we think about that a lot. And that to me was a significant shift as an SLP, as a speech language pathologist, in why am I, like as a parent, when you were checking those boxes of he's not pointing, then what do we do with that information, right? So then we want to wonder deeper about individual differences. It's not that a child doesn't want to communicate. It's not that they don't want to be part of a shared world with the rapid back and forth, but what is happening that's making that harder for them? And then how do we support it as caregivers? That's where some of the R comes in, right? So it all kind of flows together. And to me, thinking about if we can really early see some of these differences, then what can we do to support parents? What can we do to support them and knowing like, oh, I can interpret this for my kid. If they move their eyes but can't yet like move their whole hand, or that starts first, right? You move your whole hand to point to something, and then eventually you get that lovely distal point where it's just one finger. But if they can't do that, if they're sharing some eye gaze, can we as parents then model for them and interpret for them, right? So it all kind of flows together. And the more we can understand what gestures develop when and why and for what purpose, then the more we can help support parents and help support our own kind of therapeutic goals.
I love that because I know Dr. Greenspan talked a lot about in either the radio shows he did or in his writings about how parents can think that their child isn't interested because they're not showing the same things as would be expected. And so you kind of get this snowball effect where the parent stops engaging so much with the child, and then the child doesn't get that interaction. And that can be like a self-fulfilling prophecy where the child then doesn't interact with you. Versus what you're saying is, let's educate the parents and explore and be curious together about what the child is doing or not doing, and notice those other cues, like, oh, their eyes were going up, but they couldn't move their hands. And I know my little guy was a little butterball, like he was just all rolls and chubbiness of cuteness. And, you know, if I look back now, maybe I see some signs in those old videos of him having a harder time doing certain things. And he definitely, you know, with the OT always said lots of things with core because he's W sitting instead of being able to have that strength to sit up. And that's another thing. It's a little bit different than strength, because I could hold his feet and he could do a wheelbarrow walk, yet he slouches all the time. I'm getting off track here.
No, because we were talking about those individual differences, and there are so many. I mean, I use the postural control, but there are so many individual differences that can impact gestural development. And it doesn't mean we can't support gestural development, but it means we have to think about what are those individual differences, and then what can we do to help support it. Because my goal as a speech language pathologist is that every kid or teen that I see feels like communication is easy and that they're understood. I mean, those are the primary things that we should be working on, right? So I'm not looking for perfection. I'm looking for that meaning. And I'm thinking about how do I support them and their bodies and their ideation and everything else. So, motor planning, praxis affects our ability to gesture. Like you were saying, the postural control, visual spatial skills, because if we're not watching others, then it's hard for us to take in that information if we can't track. So there are so many pieces. Parent attachment, right? If I sometimes am an insecure or avoidant kind of attachment, then that child might be gesturing. I might not do anything to respond, and the child stops gesturing, right? So there are so many pieces that impact. And the more we can help parents understand what is that child doing in a communicative way, what are they doing to gesture, and then how do I support that? So like is it that my gestures have to last longer, right? Is it that I have to, when I'm playing with the kid and I do that, I don't know, with my hands up and shrug my shoulders, do I have to hold it for a long time? Right? And the other piece about gestures that goes so well with floor time is that you have to use affect to use gestures, right? I mean, I dare you to try to gesture without any kind of like affect anywhere else. You can't. It all goes together. And I was thinking about this a little bit because for sign, like sometimes people get confused with sign language and gestures, and they're very different because sign and speech are kind of stored and used in the same part of our brain, and gestures are in a different part, which I also like because I'm always thinking, how are we like using more neurons? How are we firing up more of our brain? And so if you're familiar at all with like the deaf culture, I took years of sign language as a student, so it's very analytical in my brain where sign is stored. Same place as speech, right? So early in my career, I worked in a deaf hard of hearing classroom. There was a teacher of the deaf who was deaf, and one of the best paras we had was a child of deaf adults. They called them a coda. So both of them, part of the deaf culture, both of them signers as their first language. And I could sign proficiently with them, but when they told a story, when they read a book, they used more of a gestural type of communication and the affect. And I didn't even need to know all the signs because I could watch the gestures and understand. And that's the other piece, is that if we're thinking, it's not just the child gesturing for communicative intent, but actually when we gesture, it helps the child process language better and process communication better. So we're supporting their understanding, not just their expression.
Whew, so many golden nuggets there. Like, let's review, listeners, because I mean, I know a lot of DIR practitioners listen to this too, and there's so much in what you just said. So I know when I watch, sometimes you might be watching the Olympics or something, and there's like sign language person in the corner, and I don't do it. I mean, I know a couple from when my son was little, more. I remember that.
Mm-hmm. All done?
Yes, all done. And you see like their expressions are, like it always looks almost amusing to the lay person on, watching, but it makes so much sense when you understand DIR floor time, because like you just said, you understand what they're saying and how they're expressing themselves. And again, I'm going to link back in the blog post for this podcast to the podcast I did with Jean Christian about the pre-verbal affective signaling. And I did another one with Mary Beth Stark, who's a speech pathologist in Atlanta, also about how pre-linguistics are pre-social skills or something along that line, but it's all along the same thing. And it, everything you're saying really is evidence to why DIR floor time is such an interdisciplinary practice, because what you're saying as a speech language pathologist about, oh, well, motor planning, individual differences, praxis, and like, if you're new to the podcast, you're like, what's that? It took me years to figure out what the heck motor planning and praxis meant. I'm going to link back to the Building Blocks of Motor Planning with Maud LaRue podcast I did, and the part 1 and part 2 of Praxis podcasts with OT Joanne Fleckenstein and licensed professional counselor, Mike Fields, also a parent of autistic child. And they did this amazing 2-part podcast with me on praxis that really described, my son might have an idea, but he doesn't know how to move his body to make that idea come into fruition. So that's all OT stuff. Yet you're an SLP. And then I've done sort of 2 different podcasts that could be seen as part 1 and part 2 on physical therapy with Mary Beth Crawford. And she really talks about the emotional, the sensory, and the affect systems that Greenspan really described in his early works, how they all, need to be enacted. And she talks about gaze stability and some of that stuff that you mentioned too. And so you have a clinic with an OT. So the fact that this interdisciplinary approach really helps parents. And then the next thing I was thinking is, as a parent, how many parents have an education on child development? I mean, I had a master's in psychology. I did not take child development. So, I babysat the neighborhood kids, but I did not know what child development involves. And I have 1 child, and I've only ever had 1 child. So I watched my child develop. I didn't know if it was different than other kids or not. I could see that my child was fussier than the other kids in the mommy group. And my child, fussed a lot more, needed to stand up and move him around. Well, later I learned, his vestibular system really needs that input, and his proprioceptive system needs that input, and all of these other things that it's almost like parents need a whole education on child development and how it works. And then, so I think it's so helpful to have a DIR approach where you have an SLP, an OT, a PT if needed, mental health if needed, like all these different pieces, education, if only the schools knew more about DIR, and really help parents. So I would love to dive into that a little bit more about what you said, tips for parents. So if the child isn't pointing, if the child isn't doing certain gestures, I guess you might do a screen when you first meet a client to find out where the child's at. And then how do you help parents really understand that whole floor time principle of looking at the why behind the behavior? So like you said, the child wants to participate and do all of these things, but what's preventing them from doing that? And how do you, it must feel good for parents to have someone say, look, I noticed that your child looked that way, and when he does that, you can then respond in this way. It must feel like, at least, this is so empowering.
Well, yeah, and I think you bring up so many good questions, because it's first, as a speech language pathologist, and a lot of times, I think across the board, we are the first ones that get called in, right? Because what do parents often say? I want my kids to talk. And then I come in or meet the child, and sometimes I say, yeah, I agree. We want them to do all kinds of amazing things, but here's what we have to do first developmentally. And sometimes our clinic is primarily, we take a lot of Medicaid and insurance families. So we have to, justify in some ways our therapy here in the United States to those insurance companies. And so sometimes if families have to choose between therapies, I've had kids who are 2 years old and the parents want speech therapy. That's what they come in for. And I say, if you have to choose, I wouldn't choose speech therapy. I'd choose occupational therapy or physical therapy, right? Because that foundational piece that you're talking about, if we're looking at the deeper why and chasing that deeper why, then sometimes of course, in a perfect system, I think I can definitely support the child. But sometimes if we have to choose, that other therapist might be a better choice at that stage, right? Because they need to be looking at what is happening with the motor planning system, what is happening with the, the whole body picture. So it's funny, because I have definitely had those conversations, thinking about what we do to help support parents. Oftentimes depends obviously on individual differences, but as a whole, what we want to do is look at the deeper why. Why do we think they're not gesturing in the typical way? Educate the family on what does typical or predictive development look like when it comes to gesture. So we do those bigger whole body gestures. We do different kinds of gestures to begin with. So we're doing gestures that grab attention. They're called deictic gestures. So those are like, we look at the light and point to the light, and then the parent says, oh, the light. Or we go outside and a dog walks by and we point to the dog and the parent says, oh, big dog. And then maybe the baby starts to say, or the toddler starts to say big as they point. That's a 2-word combination, right? So those kinds of gestures start first, and then we go to more representational or symbolic gestures like shh, with your finger up to your lips, or when the baby's getting the diaper change, do as a parent do what? Oh, stinky, stinky, right? So those are more symbolic. So we want them understanding how gestures develop, what they look like as they develop. And then we want them understanding their child better to know what is happening with their child. There's also, I think, a really interesting kind of gesture that's called a beat gesture, where you kind of go like this when you're talking and it emphasizes language. And the research on beat gestures say that actually, when children are doing that, they show better narrative skills later. So the ability to tell a story in an organized fashion. So sometimes it's just interesting to watch because it might give me more information about maybe where we need to support, right? So maybe we need to support parents in using more gestures, right? Maybe we need to support them in modeling more gestures and holding that gesture for longer. I've definitely had parents who do it and they're like, it's working, but I feel like a crazy person. Because they're just, going around the room or outside and pointing and holding it, or like and waiting and really using that affect. But I had said that definition that I like, that gesture is an image in material form. I like it because when I speak, that just goes, right? I speak and it's gone. And you have to be kind of like mentally picturing it, but a gesture can stay. So that's one way we can support, is by telling families, you use gestures more, model, right? And then interpret. What do you think the child is doing with their body? And can you interpret their gesture and make it meaningful?
Okay, so just quick before I comment, you said didactic gestures? Is that what you said?
Deictic gestures. And that's just, there are many different kinds of gestures. DEICTIC. And it's just a word to mean that a gesture that draws attention or points to an object or event. So those are the first kinds of things that we typically, predictive development, we see these deictic gestures first. So those are things that are kind of, if you think about it, in the room and you're drawing attention to something. So those are some of the first we see. And then later we see those kind of more representational ones, the symbolic ones.
Right, like sh and p. And you said beat gestures?
So beat gestures, that's when you're like,
B-E-A-T.
B-E-A-T. So it's that like, oh, and then I did this, and then this happened, and then you won't believe it. Then this teacher came in, and what that it's kind of like an outcropping of like, I'm mentally telling the story and I want to get it right. And so my body's into it too. But the research shows that kids who do that actually have better narrative skills later. And I just think it's interesting because we maybe don't always see some other kids doing that. So how do we use it more with kids? Are we using our gestures more? And beat gestures and those representational ones also, when we're thinking about caregivers, because what I find interesting about gestures is it's not like, okay, phew, we got them all, now we're moving on. Gestures support us across a lifetime. And we know this because there's been lots of research that shows gestures can help support working memory and also can support long-term memory. And we even know that if teachers are using more gestures when they're teaching, it can support reading comprehension and even mathematic learning.
Tell us more about that. So because they're holding the gestures and making it more meaningful with the affect, perhaps that's making more of an emotional connection for the child, and that's helping them remember it better. So if I'm giving a story about Christopher Columbus crossing the ocean blue or whatever it is, I grew up in Canada, so we didn't really hear those stories. But, and versus, and then Christopher Columbus went across in this big storm. And I mean, I'm not teaching kindergarten, but maybe you are teaching elementary school talking like that. You picture the stereotypical kindergarten teacher is one who's using lots of affect. Okay, kids, how are we doing today? And of course, not every teacher is like that, but I'm willing to bet that a lot of kids like those kinds of teachers better, especially when they're younger. And as you said, it's supporting long and short-term memory, but I've never heard that before. So tell us a little bit more about that reading comprehension and math stuff that you mentioned.
Yeah, the first time I thought about it in this way is, I don't know if you're familiar with the visualizing and verbalizing curriculum. So years and years ago, they did some studies with this curriculum, and what they did fMRI studies of autistic children before and after. They did this curriculum approach, and actually changed their brains doing this approach, that parts of their brains were talking to other parts of their brains that hadn't been before. And the whole part of this approach that is fascinating to me is that it's about concept imagery. And it's a reading comprehension approach to help support concept imagery. And it's the idea that when a child or a person, it really can be even into adults, is reading, you should be making this movie in your head. And I think about this a lot because it goes back to this meaning making and all the other things we talk about in DIR Floortime, is that we have to have this imagery in our head, right? We have to have that imagery, and then that imagery we get to play around with. And that imagery is also what locks us in, and we can be in a different place and we can recall that, right? So one thing when you're learning about this visualizing and verbalizing approach is that they tell you one way you can tell that a child is using their concept imagery is they start to gesture. Okay. And they start. So I was like, that's interesting, right? So I started looking at it more and looking at why are they gesturing more, and why is that telling us they're using the imagery? And really the research shows that when we are gesturing, we're using a different part of our brain, right? So we're externalizing info, and we're also creating like a visual motor representation, different part of our brain than speech. And so working memory, we need to activate it, and we need something to kind of hold on to. So a gesture we can hold on to. And also by using the gesture, like you were doing with your gestures of and then Christopher Columbus went across the sea, then that image holds and stays. And then that's what long-term memory is, right? And that there has been some research also that using gestures to help support long-term memory, then we can kind of play around with that long-term memory, that mental representation. Because again, we're talking about more mental imaging and not just words. So it's interesting because if we can use more gestures as parents, or we ask our children to use more gestures, then we see it having a role in working memory and long-term memory. So one easy thing that we talk about with parents a lot, and this is based on some information from Sarah Ward, she's a speech language pathologist out of Boston, Massachusetts, and she's an expert in executive functioning. Highly recommend her courses. She gives the strategy of show and tell. So if you have a kid who you're like, okay, you need to go upstairs and take a shower and then get your stuff ready for tomorrow, that's all the verbal, that's all the speech, right? But if you tell them, okay, now show and tell me your plan, and they have to then gesture it. They have to say, okay, first I'm going to take my clothes and throw them in the hamper, and then I'm going to get in the shower and shower. And then you said, oh, I need to get my clothes out and put them on my bed and get ready for tomorrow. That is different. And then they're probably going to remember it a lot better. And so that's an easy thing to do, but it's firing up a different part of our brain. It's connecting different parts of our brain than before.
Okay, this is amazing. I'm going to do that exercise with my parent group in the parent support meetings that I facilitate for ICDL. That's incredible. So it leads very nicely to the question that I held back on, which is, what if the parents are also neurodivergent, which is highly possible since it's genetic, and most of the parents don't know they're neurodivergent until years later, like I recently found out. And so they may not naturally gesture the same way. And in turn, their children not only have the predisposition not to gesture in that way, but then they also aren't getting that. And that leads to part two of the question: is it ableist of us to be telling them they need to do something that's not natural to them in order to make their child develop that's more neurotypical? Or I would think the latter, that we are just promoting development so the child will be able to communicate clearer. And it's, again, this whole thing about neurodiversity affirming care and everything is so new with this neurodiversity movement in the last 10 or so years. Since Neurotribes, we recently lost Steve Silberman. That was sad.
I know.
But he, really launched this movement into the forefront, and there's so many neurodiversity affirming information out there, and neurodivergent led therapies and approaches and clinics and stuff like that. There's not a lot of research on autistic development per se, and you hear a lot of self-advocates saying it's different than neurotypical development, but we are all human beings and development is development. So there's this fine line between it needs to look this way, neurotypical, versus it can look different ways, but it's all the same type of developmental steps. It's just going to look different and happen on a different timeline. And that, I think, in the research field is still to be determined, but I think us in DIRFloortime believe that it can look different. We can be neurodiversity affirming. We can be very respectful and not force anybody to look neurotypical, but we do want to help them to empower themselves to be able to communicate more clearly. So I'll let you take that hot plate.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question, because it brings up a good point in that we never, like I said, my goal is communication is easy and you're understood, which means I'm going to take any communicative effort you give me, and I'm going to say it's intentional and meaningful. So that means if I have a primarily non-speaking child who uses a device, I'm not going to have them use their device and then make them use a gesture, right? And I'm not going to make them use my conventional gestures. I have plenty of kids who are neurodiverse and maybe have struggles with praxis and use a device, but also use a lot of gestures that they've come up with on their own because it's easiest for their body. And then what do I have to do? I have to understand their gestures. I have to have a deep relationship with them, understand their gestures and their meaning behind them, right? So I have a kid whose go is this, right? He puts his hand flat onto his chest and that's go. Now, I'm not going to make him use more of a conventional gesture. I'm not going to make him use his device. That is meaningful. He has attached that symbol, has a meaning, and then I honor it, right? And so in that way, I'm being neurodiversity affirming. When we're talking about more of these kind of strategies to help promote working memory and long-term memory, it might be, I'm not going to force a kid, but we might bump their edges and just say, let's just try it, right? Let's just try it. And even for parents or caregivers who are neurodiverse themselves, we might say, maybe you might try it. You might try doing some more gesturing and see how that feels, because we all are wanting to know. Executive functioning is like a really big buzz terminology right now, and we're all wanting to know, how do we support that? So maybe we do think about, how am I using my gestures and how is my child, and can I support them? It's just another modality. And really another piece of the gestures, and why I keep going back to the imaging, is the more we can give supports in visual form to everyone, the more we're supporting their comprehension. And comprehension is essential for regulation, right? Everybody wants to feel that they understand what's going on around them in the world. And when we don't, we tend to dysregulate. So if I can give visuals, and sometimes visuals are gestures, then I'm supporting that child in a different way.
I want to put a link also in the blog post to my podcast with Occupational Therapist Maud LaRue on visualization leads to imagination, because I wanted to throw that in earlier when you talked about it. And you mentioned about reading, you're visualizing what's happening. And she was talking about, and in podcasts, a recent podcast where we talked about from FEDC4 into FEDC5, where we're working on that visualization in FEDC4, so the functional, emotional, developmental capacity. The fourth one, which is complex communication and shared problem solving, where you want to visualize something, because once you can visualize it, you said, then you can do something with it. And it might just be representational stuff that you've seen from somewhere and you're remembering. Like my son is remembering all the different things that happened in Curious George or Super Mario or Inside Out 2, which he's totally obsessed with right now. He loves it so much. The anxiety character is so cute and funny. And anger with his like flame hair coming up. So he's has that imagery, but then the next step is leading to novel imagination where you come up with your own ideas. And so that all ties into all this stuff that you're talking about.
Which is one of the best parts about DIR, is that the evidence for DIR is not just rooted in looking at Floortime and doing, these blind studies and peer-reviewed journal articles about Floortime itself. It's looking at all the other research, right? And to me, when we're talking about therapeutic goals or how we're supporting caregivers, if we're thinking about this bigger picture of like imagery, it's so important for all of these different things, then what are we doing to support imagery at different stages of development, right? And so supporting imagery through use of maybe gestures is just one piece of that component that you're talking about. Then if we're using those even starting when we have kids working in capacities 3 and 4, well, wow, this is going to help strengthen 5, 6, and beyond.
Absolutely. And before we wrap up, I just want to harp on the point that you said, holding the gesture longer, using that affect. Like that's my site is called Affect Autism because of that whole, affect diathesis paper from, Greenspan's original thesis there, that, it's the affect, it's the emotional connection that drives development, and along with, sensory motor affect. So just having that gesture held longer, and immediately I think of Dr. Tippy going, that's his main thing that you see him doing, like, because he wants to promote, like, what's the child gonna come back with, instead of we're always waiting and we can't wait that long, so we respond instead of letting the child respond to us, like. So just holding gestures longer and using that affect.
I just want us all to be thinking as developmental therapists or people who are developmentally minded about that deeper why. And I think understanding gestural development and why it's so important helps us to chase that deeper why and then support those individual differences, which in the end makes us really more neurodiversity affirming, and keeping in mind that all individuals are, unique, and also like bringing such amazing things to us. And it's such a gift to get to do this kind of work.
And on that point, it's a developmental mindset. So you can't teach certain skills. Like if we're looking at it developmentally, you need to know what comes first, what comes next developmentally. How does the brain develop? And that's why DIRFloortime is a developmental approach, because like you said, this happens before this next thing happens, before this next thing happens. And that's even though my son might have done it 5 or 6 years later than timeline would say children develop, like he did all of those things exactly in the way it unfolded, exactly in the way that FEDCs are laid out. I've watched my son go through them slowly. It's like blows my mind away every time I see something new come up, and I'm like, just like Maud said would happen a few years ago, just like Dr. Tippy told me he would eventually be doing. Like it's just amazing to me. I love this model. I love how it pulls in everything else that's, it's not like it's necessarily anything new, but it's just pulling in all the facts and drawing them together, and that theory guides the way we use all of that information from all the different disciplines. So this was so interesting. I love when I've been doing this podcast for however many years, and there's still new light bulbs coming off with new podcasts. So thank you for bringing those new light bulbs to me today, Brookes. And I will put links to Brookes's clinic and past blogs and podcasts we talked about. And you can check that out at affectautism.com under Gestural Development. Thank you so much, Brookes.
Thank you. This was great.
Thank you for listening. This episode of We Chose Play was made possible with the generous financial support of Affect Autism's members at patreon.com/affectautism and of the International Council on Development and Learning, ICDL.com. If you liked this episode, please share it with someone, like and subscribe, sign up for the newsletter at affectautism.com, and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, or Instagram.
Until next time, here's to choosing play and experiencing joy every day.